it was a pretty boneheaded move. And I think this is going to be a wake-up call. This is not the first one, but this is the biggest one that we've seen.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Tank Talks. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, and today marks a very special milestone for us. This is our 200th episode. That's right, you heard me, 200 episodes. When I started this journey almost 4 years ago, I had no idea where it would lead. From those early, and let's be honest, pretty embarrassing episodes, we've grown a lot together. We've had the privilege of chatting with some of the most brilliant minds in the startup and investment world. I want to take a moment to reflect on how far we've come and share a few pieces of advice for those of you thinking about starting your own podcast. First off, don't be afraid, make mistakes, and just get started. My early episodes were far from perfect, but each one was a learning experience for me, and I kept pushing forward, and eventually I found my voice. Secondly, consistency is key. Whether you're recording on a schedule, or worried about the quality of your content, or just the way you engage with your audience, staying consistent is key, and you will build trust and loyalty with your audience, just like all of you have with me tuning in every week. And lastly, always stay curious and keep learning. Every guest has something unique to offer, whether you think it or not, just by judging their LinkedIn profile or bio. And every conversation is an opportunity for you and your guest to grow. I want to thank all of our listeners for your support over the years, as well as our partners and sponsors. And now let's dive into our 200th episode with our favorite guest, John Ruffolo. All right, John, welcome back. Episode 200. Woo. We've done it. Episode 200. Absolutely embarrassing.
Right.
Where's your hat? I'll send it in the mail, I guess. It got lost in the CrowdStrike, a mail glitch. But this is episode 200, as we've talked in the preamble. It's also coincides with my 40th birthday. I've officially crossed over to the other side of darkness. It feels great. Thank you very much. But there's a lot of news to cover here, John. I think for everyone in Canada listening, the biggest news, I think, in the tech ecosystem that dropped this week was the news of Clio's $3 billion valued Series F round. You don't have a lot of Series Fs in Canada. The headline as it came out was a $900 million USD Series F round led by New Enterprise Associates, NEA, marking, quote unquote, the largest software funding round in tech history for Canada, highlighting some significant growth for Clio, as they say they've reached over 200 million US in ARR. Now, this was a mixture of primary and secondary capital, and it seems like it's a bit of a cleaning up of the cap table, if you will, maybe ahead of a pre-IPO in its future. And the other investors that joined the round include Goldman Sachs Asset Management, Sixth Street Growth, Alphabet's Capital G, and Tidemark. What are your thoughts here? I have my thoughts, but would love to hear what you think about this.
Huge congratulations and kudos to Jack. I've spent a lot of time with Jack, and incredible entrepreneur. The one thing or actually two interesting things about this business. Number one, I think you and I have talked about this before. Jack reminds me every time I see him that I turned him down several times over the last 10 plus years because I kept on, my brain thinks on a horizontal market expansion strategy where he was increasing his TAM, always going vertically and digging deeper and deeper into the legal business. And it's interesting that he's been able to do that quite successfully. And sometimes we think that these markets are so small, but I didn't imagine all of the things that this business would be doing, literally running a law firm. And that's number one. Number two, when you read the commentary on why people were excited about this, it was an area where Gen AI in particular could play an interesting role. Yeah, perhaps not rendering legal opinions per se, but the business of law is really researching and trying to find case support, etc. So it's a very natural Gen AI business, and I think the market really liked it a lot. And funny enough, on that same day or the day afterwards, Harvey also raised about $100 million as well. So here is one vertical that maybe Gen AI is taking a front lead on from an application perspective.
I'm a little shocked, John, to hear that you didn't see the vertical TAM expansion with Clio as you did maybe with Shopify, right? Because it kind of has a resemblance of a Shopify, building its app store, going vertically down into the e-commerce layer, but into the legal tech side, and then expanding its TAM internationally. So maybe you just fell asleep at the wheel there, but I won't hold that against you. But in terms of what this means from a market perspective, so when I read this headline of $900 million Series F, but secondary and primary tied together, I extrapolated this as probably a $600 million secondary cleanup of earlier investors and employees who wanted to get liquidity, obviously because they weren't getting timed on the IPO window perfectly, and a $300 million primary round where they bought 10% at a $3 billion valuation. Is that what you think it jived out as?
I don't know, so I'm not releasing any confidential information. I actually would even expect it to be even more extreme than that, and much. I wouldn't be surprised if the secondary was a lot higher than that. From an operating perspective, they really didn't need the money in operating its current business. So, but I would say that there might be opportunities for acquisitions, particularly in the Gen AI legal space. So I could see the capital on that, but do you need 300 million for that? You probably need at least 100, maybe two. So, but I think the general vicinity, you're absolutely correct. This was more of a recap type transaction, getting it ready. Yeah, in a very positive way. And maybe you don't really ever have to worry about going public. And, why would you need to if you have a fortified balance sheet?
So I think what I would like people to maybe take away from this is, number one, the headline of $900 million Series F fundraise is not actually primary capital. The interesting thing is NEA priced this at, 13 times, give or take. So $3 billion for 10% ownership, let's say, on a $200 million run rate, probably in line with where the public markets would value this. You have a mixture of maybe preferred Series F shares and purchasing of either earlier preferred shares or even common shares from employees, combining that to grow ownership for all the new investors, while also limiting the amount of shares and pref shares that you need to crunch going into a liquidity event, let's say an IPO. Plus, you mix that with new capital to go out and do acquisitions. I'm just trying to put the recipe together for people to understand what happens actually.
Yeah, and the only little tweak I would say is I'm going to guess that the primary and secondary values were different.
Agreed. That's why your average price valuation probably comes closer down to the last round's valuation.
Correct. So, a 13 times forward would be very expensive, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was closer to a 10 times forward or thereabouts. And then whatever the discount is on the shares that they purchased. And again, it depends which series of shares and whether it was common shares. So as you go down the stack, you assign different discounts. So the common shares, for example, could be at a very significant discount. And when you do the blending of it all, it gets to an attractive enough valuation point to do, the full recap type transaction.
Exactly. And I think people know, common shares are typically sometimes 70%, but can be as tight as 20%, to the pref stack. And so blending all that together is where a new investor gets their average entry price into the company. Obviously there are these types of transactions happening. And then on the other side, you have what appears to be a full primary transaction in the Cohere Series D announcement that was first reported in June and then officially announced the closing of the round with, I believe, 550 million, topped off by, interesting enough, a lot of a hedge fund and sort of public market asset managers coming in to round out the round at a total of $5.5 billion valuation. This comes after, a pretty recent 270 million Series C round done last year. So what are your thoughts on this? And how do you think about some of the asset managers coming in to round out this investment?
Yeah, I mean, as a general comment, not specific to this case, whenever you see tourist investors, you're always wondering, are you at the top of a bubble? Same thing happened in 2021 on the growth side, and then they all, led by the Tigers and Go-Tos, of the world, and then they disappear. I don't know what the motivation here was, but right around the same time as that financing, there's been the media reports about OpenAI and Anthropic requiring massive amount of capital and going to be out in the market again. And the amount of their capital requirements are greater than that what was predicted, primarily because the costs to operate the LLMs was far greater than what was estimated. So what's interesting is the timing of those two combined with this fundraise. It's hard to see right now, but are we really at the top of a bubble? And are investors going to start to get a little bit skittish knowing that a company like OpenAI, they're going to be raising another, how many billion after raising 10 billion not that long ago. And I just wonder what the market reaction will be for this space, probably within the next few months.
Right. I think, yeah, it definitely begs the question, at the run rate that Cohere is reported to be at, call it 35, 40 million or so, and, raising what they've raised, and then hearing what Anthropic's run rate is, and then how much money they're burning, 2.7 billion, I think was the number for the year. And then OpenAI's 3.5 billion or so run rate growing, pretty healthy, and also burning as much as they are on a net burn. It is questionable. Yeah, it really does make you wonder if we're at the tourist capital stage. Switching gears from AI for a sec, John, obviously there was a crazy world event that happened that now I don't, wasn't personally affected by. I don't know if your firm was, but the CrowdStrike outage was a global outage due to a faulty update to its Falcon security platform. And so the issue for people who weren't, living under a rock or were living under a rock and didn't see it was originated from a sensor configuration update that was released at 4:09 UTC time. And this update triggered a huge logic error in their channel file, so leading to a huge system crash on Windows devices that were running this Falcon 9 server at 7.11 above. So basically, this was a major outage affecting 8.5 million Windows devices worldwide. You're talking banking, airlines, media, total disruption. 5,000 plus flights were canceled. Many businesses were basically ground to a halt. This was crazy. And this was not a cyber attack, which is also very shocking, maybe in a good way, but also very shocking that this can happen. What are your thoughts here? Obviously, we know the remediation against CrowdStrike, their stock got punished. But what do you think this means for this sort of rebooting of our cybersecurity infrastructure, our utility infrastructure, our banking?
I think this is going to be a wake-up call. This is not the first one, but this is the biggest one that we've seen. I think people were surprised on, it was a pretty boneheaded move on the upgrade when you go through the step-by-step what wasn't actually done, and you start to see the walled gardens, infrastructure level software, what it can do to the world. And we're not fully, operating our businesses on systems like this. But let's just say that this happens when, people are using Gen AI to run their entire businesses sometime in the future. What happens? What gets paralyzed? And I do think that the whole idea, again, of open source infrastructure software is going to be looked at more and more strongly, because when something like this happens, you're not relying on one single vendor or a single, point of failure mistake where you have a lot of redundancy naturally built in through an open source system. So I am really wondering whether this is going to start to become, again, the mood as a result of this.
Yeah, it's like, the digital supply chain, right? We see the physical supply chains being disrupted by a global pandemic or war in the Ukraine, but now you have digital supply chains that basically grind, countries and industries to a halt. And I think it kind of outlines the sort of risk associated with software updates and the importance of having very robust contingency plans in place. For startups out there listening, there's a reason why there's a lot of compliance and security questionnaires and audits that are required to sell to enterprise, because as soon as you connect to them, whether it's through the cloud or through APIs or things like that, they have to take all that into consideration around their core business being affected by anything that happens to third-party vendors that integrate with them. Yeah, I think that was a big lesson. I think a wake-up call, as you call it, for a lot of people out there. The other thing that I don't think was a big wake-up call, but I definitely think it may have been for Joe Biden, was when he woke up on July 21st and realized he was out of a job. So I'm just curious, how did people not see this coming? And do you think there is conspiracy behind all the things that led up to this point? You know, given the shaky debate performance, the pressure from a lot of big billionaire donors, obviously playing into the age and health decline. And then all of a sudden, this letter that looks like it was written on Canva or something to support Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee, you know, and just transferring the money over to her, which obviously Trump is now, you know, his party has launched a lawsuit against that. What are your thoughts on this? And how do you think this plays out in November?
Talk about soap operas here. Again, let's separate the politics from just the events on here. What I found surprising is, first of all, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, again, I really don't care. But here's a guy spent over 50 years of his career, and the people closest to him obviously knew, it was very evident for a long time, particularly on the debate, that he's not a well man. They treated him like a Weekend at Bernie's. And if it was up to him and his handlers, it's hard to differentiate the two, he didn't want to go anywhere. And basically, as somebody, I think, stated, I think this was about as close to a democratic coup, and I don't mean Democratic Party, but in a democratic society, coup that you're going to see, that basically his party turned against him. That's unprecedented in our history. And so seeing that, I was still saddened by this whole situation. The second part of it, which is kind of interesting, now that the coup has been done, they're worried that it looks too much like a coup. So let's pretend that there is not a coronation, and let's throw in some other folks so that we can actually do our voting so that, you know, we don't look like we're being undemocratic. And the thing that just perplexes me, it was only 4 years ago that Kamala was able to only muster, 6% of the Democratic primaries votes against when Biden won the primaries. So she was only able to get 6%. And now they're talking like she is, you know, the gift that they've been waiting for. What happened 4 years ago? Like, what is the massive transformation? So I just see a party in disarray. The betting, if you look at the odds makers, is still Trump about a 60% chance versus he was up in the 70, 80% chance with Biden. So I still think that he's going to end up winning it just because his base of support is extremely strong and very congealed. So we'll see. But man, oh man, who would have predicted all of this craziness in such a short period of time? Oh, they couldn't even script this.
Hollywood, that's who probably would have predicted this, as so many times.
Yeah, Simpsons probably closer, but Hollywood, people would look at this and say, no, that's such a bullshit story. No one's ever going to believe that this would happen.
No, the point you made, though, John, that I still have a bone to pick with is how people in the Democratic Party are still doing a lot of hand waving when it serves their purposes rather than calling the truth and coming forward with the truth, because it definitely feels there's a lot of puppet mastery happening in that party, and they've never learned from their lessons in the past. And that was something I guess I would say that the Republicans have owned up to, and then they've totally shaken themselves down, or Trump shook them down to what actually the populace wanted. And the Democrats are still holding on to this legacy Democratic like process of talking through the media, contriving a story, and telling people to look left hand while ignoring the right hand. And I think people have become a little bit too smart to actually believe that. Maybe not, but it definitely feels like the tide has finally changed. You're right. Biden probably at the day he went into office was, you know, mentally sound, but declined repeatedly over. And they were still telling he was fit for office, fit for office, fit for office. And then eventually they pull the rug out from underneath him and shove, Harris in your face and say, yes, he's patriotic, he's doing the right thing, but don't worry about any of that stuff that's in the past. Let's look forward to the future. And that's sort of weird because they're still judging everything about Trump did on the past. So they won't even look at themselves in the mirror on the past, but judge their competition on only the past. And that to me seems a very unauthentic. That's the biggest thing I have with this process that just doesn't sit right with me. Not saying who I would pick either way, but it definitely feels very untruthful. Not that politics have any truth to them anyways, but how do you think this plays out though for Trudeau and the situation he's been facing, I guess, in his own party in Canada?
I mean, there's a little bit of a parallel here. I mean, if you look at, the most recent polls, and of course, we're a year out, so anything could happen. It does look like right now it will be a whitewash of the current government and the Conservatives coming in. Now, if Trump comes in, it's likely not good news for Canada, but the view is that it would probably be a better relationship with Poilievre than it would with Trudeau. And Trump has not forgiven Trudeau after the event that happened. Was it the G7 or G20 summit a number of years ago where Trump had left early and Trudeau was accused of saying something behind his back. And Trump cares about Trump and never forgave and put Canada into the penalty box. So that would probably be a pretty brutal combination of the two. But if it's with Pierre, perhaps, or with Poilievre, perhaps it will be, from a fresh start. But at the end of the day, Trump is about Trump. He's not about anything else, including the United States, in my view. So very hard to predict what would happen. As somebody had said to me, the good news out of all of this is, I feel badly for my U.S. friends where they don't feel they have a good choice between the two parties. After this, maybe we'll get parties with sensible candidates that are perhaps before their best years are behind them. So maybe things will be looking brighter a few years from now, but who knows?
John, remember I forgot to mention the Jamie Dimon headline that has come around now of him becoming U.S. Secretary. What are your thoughts? I mean, this is like the rite of passage as it was.
I was reading about what are the odds for Trump to select Jamie Dimon, and the article I read, it was a U.S.-based article, says it was an extremely low probability of that ever happening. I wouldn't be surprised if Jamie would want that because tax-free, people don't know that. It's the great wash out your gain transaction, right?
Loophole.
I think that Trump likes somebody that he could control, and he will not be able to control Jamie Dimon.
John, I just want to thank you for, going on this journey with me. 200 episodes, it sounds like a lot, but honestly, looking back over the 4 years, I wouldn't have picked a better partner to have these conversations with. So, here's to 200 more. And thank you to all the listeners for joining us every week for our weekly news rundown.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, John. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tank Talks. We hope you found today's conversation as insightful as we did. If you're enjoying the show, we've got 3 quick things to ask of you. First, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, or YouTube. Next, follow us and stay up to date on upcoming episodes and behind-the-scenes content on social media with Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And lastly, share the love. If you found value in today's episode, share with a friend or colleague who'd benefit too. Your support helps us bring in more amazing guests and keeps the Tank Talks engine running. That's it for today. Until next time, keep disrupting and innovating.